So earlier in the week we read Luke 23, that was in the readings, and we've read it again together this morning because I'd like us to consider that chapter together just now. In this chapter we read Luke's account of the trial and crucifixion of Jesus and the events and the interactions that take place around it. And there's a lot for us to think about in this chapter. There's lots going on. Some of it is very difficult and sad to read and think about, but it gives us a really powerful reminder of the incredible character of Jesus, the immense sacrifice he made, and it gives us hope for the future as well. And that's why we're going to spend a little time just now looking at this chapter before we share the bread and the wine together to remember the sacrifice that we read about in Luke chapter 23. So, as I said, there's lots to take from this chapter. I just want us to focus on two things this morning that are perhaps very obvious already, but they are emphasized repeatedly throughout this chapter. And because of that, I think we should consider them very carefully, and we should think about what they tell us about Jesus and what we can learn or take into our lives as his disciples. And these two general points that get emphasized are, first of all, the fact that Jesus was an innocent man. I'm not telling you anything groundbreaking here, but Luke, in writing this chapter, clearly wanted to remind us of that fact. And the second point is about Jesus' behavior in that awful situation that he was put in. His self-control, his continual care for others. This is something that's clear throughout the entire chapter as well, and I want us to have a think about that. So first of all, I just want us to do a quick high-level skim over the chapter just now and pull out a few quotes. At the start, in the first few verses, Jesus has false accusations leveled against him, and Pilate says to the people in verse 4, "I find no guilt in this man." So despite everything that's been said, he finds no guilt. More accusations come, then he's sent to Herod, where he's mocked and treated disrespectfully, and then he's sent back to Pilate. Pilate then says to the priests and the rulers in verse 14, "After examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him." And then he reminds them that the same was true for Herod as well. In verse 15, "Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him." Then in verse 18, we see that the people call for the release of Barabbas. And we won't dwell on this point right now, but it's a very interesting name. Bar, meaning son of in Aramaic, and then Abba, meaning father. The people here choose the wrong son of the father. They choose a murderous rebel. They want him to be released into their society over the true son of the father. And Pilate responds to their request for Barabbas by giving them another reminder in verse 22. "What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death." The people keep calling for him to be killed. And then in verse 25, Pilate gives in and he releases Barabbas. And I think this, the name of the man that they chose instead, should really have been just another reminder for the people of what it was that they were doing, another opportunity for them to stop and think about what it was they were doing. But it doesn't help them. Jesus is then crucified. He's put through awful verbal and physical abuse, and then we read this dialogue between the two thieves on the cross. They speak to each other and to Jesus, and we'll look at this interaction again in a moment. But one of the thieves says in verse 41, "We are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then Jesus speaks to the thief, and then we read that Jesus dies. And we're told in one of the following verses about an onlooker's words, a centurion, in verse 47. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." So, reading through this chapter about Jesus' death and the events and the interactions that surround it, we're given 6 reminders, at least 5 separate ones, that he is an innocent man, that he did not deserve to die. He had done nothing wrong. He was a righteous man. And despite all of these reminders, some of which were witnessed by those who were seeking to kill Jesus, he was still put to death. And these reminders of innocence make it all the more saddening and terrible to think about what he had to go through. And it shows us as well just how awful the people who did this to him were. And for us, reading all of these reminders now, I think we're told 2 things. The first is the obvious point. It's heavily reinforced for us that Jesus had done nothing wrong. He was a good man, in case we were in any doubt. He was indeed that perfect, blameless, spotless, unblemished sacrifice that the world needed as the sacrifice for sin, that sacrifice once for all time. And Luke wants us to be sure of that. And the second big thing I think we're given here is a really powerful lesson in humility, meekness, and self-control to the absolute maximum. How do we feel when someone wrongs us, when we feel like we've been treated unfairly, or someone takes advantage of us, cheats us out of something that we feel we deserve? I know it makes me feel angry. Sometimes, maybe often, more often than not, my first instinct will to think about getting my own back, writing a complaint, getting what I think I deserve, showing them their fault, proving my innocence. Jesus had done nothing wrong, and he allows himself, even with the power to stand up to them and fight back and save his own skin, he doesn't. He keeps quiet and he takes it. And just reading from Isaiah 53, there's a verse there where it says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." So we've been reminded of his innocence, and we've been given a masterclass in self-control. And I think we're also given another very powerful lesson throughout this chapter that has so much going on. I think there's something else that keeps cropping up for us to take note of. We see how much Jesus cared for others throughout his entire life. And if he did nothing more before he died, and his death, of course, being him caring for others in the ultimate way, if he did nothing else to care for others before he died, we wouldn't hold it against him. He did so much whilst he was healthy and traveling around all those different areas, meeting all those people. He didn't need to do anything more to show that he cared. But in this chapter, we see that even when he is being mistreated, verbally and physically, even when his body is battered, bruised, bleeding, even in those circumstances, he shows that his first priority is not himself, it's other people. He's looking out for those around him, and in laying down his life, he's looking out for those around him still, but even for those who are putting him through this horrific ordeal, and for all of the people who will live in generations to come like us. Let's just have a quick look at some of these examples of his incredible love and care throughout this chapter. Jesus has a group of people following him as he's carrying his cross. At this point, we know from other Gospels that he's been beaten and tortured, kept awake for hours. He's probably lost a lot of blood, and unsurprisingly, he's physically unable to carry his cross at this point, so it's been taken off him. He turns to the women in the group who are clearly upset and mourning for him, witnessing this terrible miscarriage of justice and brutal mistreatment of an innocent man. And he says to them in verse 28, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children." So he's giving them bad news here, but he's directing their pity and their sympathy away from himself and instead onto them. He's warning them and preparing them for the events that lie ahead for them and their children and the rest of the city. He's not self-pitying, feeling sorry for himself, crying out at the injustice. He's thinking about others ahead of himself, when most other people would certainly be desperate for some sympathy, for some help. We then read that he is crucified, his body in the state that we've already seen it up to the point of him carrying his cross, as if that wasn't awful enough. He's then put through one of the most brutal executions conceived by humans in history, excruciatingly painful and completely degrading. Just after he's put through that, he says something that I guess none of us would expect from any other human. And sorry to be graphic, but I think it's important for making this point. Whilst he's hanging there with his body weight going through the nails in his hands and his feet, with his flayed back pressed against the wood of the cross, the crown of thorns digging into his head, the whole body, the traumas from the countless beatings that he'd received. In that state, in verse 34, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He asks for the forgiveness of those who've just done that to him, perfectly exemplifying his teaching from earlier in the Gospels. In the Beatitudes, in Matthew 5, he says in verse 44, "Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven." He then has this interaction with one of the thieves who's hung next to him. After all he's been through and in the situation he's now in, if I imagine myself in that situation, I expect I would give no response. I would have no care for any other person other than myself. The pain that I would be in, just desperate to be given relief. Maybe at most I would manage a shut up and leave me alone, but none of that from Jesus. Verse 43 of Luke 23, he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." And this is all the more impressive as well when we remember that in Matthew's gospel we're told that it's both of the thieves that mock him. So I'd be even less inclined to be giving words of comfort to, in this physical state, to someone who had just been mocking me with everyone else. But Jesus doesn't think like that. And finally we read his last words in verse 46, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." So although this isn't him caring for those around him as such, I think this is still another important example of caring for the right things. Even in this situation where he could easily be distracted by the pain and the exhaustion, could easily be thinking about himself, he directs his thoughts to his Father. He is aligned with his Father's will and completely trusts in him until his final breath. How many times do we have a hectic, exhausting day and forget to pray or lose time to read our Bible? Again, I think Jesus leaves us with little room for excuses for forgetting to communicate with our Father, with him doing this in his final moment, in his state of discomfort and exhaustion, to put it lightly. And then also throughout all the hours leading up to that final breath, that's how he was. When we look at lessons from Jesus' behavior, we might be tempted to say, well, he was the perfect Son of God. He had the Holy Spirit, so we'll never be like him, never be able to be like him. That's true, but we'll never be entirely perfect like him in this life. But we should do our best to align our lives and our behavior little by little, more and more closely with him. We can't be perfect, but he shows us the correct way to behave, which we should pay attention to and remember when we might feel naturally justified to act in another way, and maybe understandably so from a human perspective. But Jesus' behavior here in this chapter is exactly what we should be trying our best to align with it. It's completely counter to natural human instincts, completely counter to what the world would tell us we should do in the same scenarios. He flips human thinking upside down. We might feel justified to behave in certain ways when we're hard done to or made fun of, They did it to me first. They've done something worse. Or I'm just having a bad day. I'm just in a bad mood. That's just the way I am. Hangry. Whatever the excuse is, there is no excuse, really, when we look at Jesus' example here. As unnatural as it might feel, we should be trying hard to emulate this humility, this gentleness, this slowness to anger, this resistance to fight back, to get our own back, get what we deserve, get what they owe me. And we should be thinking and making sure that we look out for and care for others as much as we can, whenever we can. Jesus shows by behaving in this way, under these circumstances, that there's no excuse for not showing these traits, as hard as it may be sometimes, and however we might try and justify it, because he did it in the hardest of circumstances. He had all the potential excuses, and we know that we need to be like him, and that's the right way to behave. So Luke's reminded us this morning of Jesus' innocent, righteous nature, and because of that nature, in his death, he offered up the perfect sacrifice to wipe away the sins of the world. And he's reminded us, as followers of this man, what's expected of us and our behavior and attitudes towards others. And now with the bread and the wine, we remember all of this and the amazing hope that we have because of that sacrifice and his glorious resurrection from the dead. And I'm just going to finish by reading a little bit more from Isaiah 53 again. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sins of many and makes intercession for the transgressors.